I feel like work has kind of become unorthodox. And when I say that, I mean what we used to hold true about work and what was traditional is kind of not traditional anymore. And I loved hearing the kickoff of the conference for these 2 days, because I think that's what we're trying to hit on with this session. So work is becoming more and more non-traditional. There's more companies out there than ever before. Most industries are really, really competitive, especially if you work in an industry involving technology, which I think many of us do that come to this conference. And so for this reason, companies are gonna have a harder time pivoting in this unorthodox environment if they don't have the right talent. If you don't have the right people in place to help navigate through these times, everything's harder, like if you don't have the right people. And I'm sure many of you can think about the cost of what happens when there's a bad hire that gets brought into a company during a time of disruption. It makes everything more difficult. The thing that's interesting is really talented people are going to be able to help businesses pivot during this time of disruption and times of change. These are people that are highly engaged. They're going to help you see behind corners. They're going to work extra hard. But these talented people have choices. I really firmly believe that long gone are the days where people want to stay at the same job for 10 years for a steady paycheck. That's kind of like my pet peeve when people are like, well, it's just they're getting paid, so isn't that motivation enough? And I'm like, no, like people have choices that are really motivated. And so it's actually a really bad business decision to not be unorthodox and intentional about the way that you keep talent, especially if a company is going through really hard times that they haven't navigated before. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is, in this phase of disruption where really talented people have choices, how do you get unorthodox? How do you get really creative to keep the really talented people at your company so that you can pivot into the next journey? And I kind of believe 3 core things that I hope you'll take away today if you want to retain talent really creatively and differently in order to make this happen. The first thing I believe is retaining talent is all about finding what I call the engagement gaps. So like, what are the things standing in the way of talented people being engaged? The second thing I believe about this is in order to find these engagement gaps, you need to have a very specific set of leadership skills, leadership traits to be able to uncover these. I think a lot of these are found in teaching, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And then the third thing I hope you'll take away is once you find these engagement gaps, these problems in the organization, that's where you can be creative and really use your HR skill set or toolkit to bring programs, bring solutions to leaders that are really easy for them to implement and execute so that those gaps begin to close over time and so that the talented people stay. And I'm going to illustrate this in 2 examples. One through a company that I worked at called Discovery Communications, which is a very large media company. That's where we created an in-house development program called Ad Sales Academy to about 400 people. And then the other thing I'm going to give you a little preview on is what we're doing at Kargo, the mobile ad tech company that I'm at. And Marianne and Maddie are here with me on my team. And we are taking a little bit of a more agile approach because this is kind of a fast kind of tech environment. And the small things that we're doing around replacing our former temperature survey with a thing called company council, which is department representatives that share feedback to our exec team, and then how we're bringing in talent planning for the first time to help leaders really be able to talk about talent in a very consistent way. So little unorthodox twists before I get into these 2 examples. The way I learned how to do this was through being a teacher at a high poverty school for 2 years. So quick show of hands, has anyone here heard of Teach for America? Okay. So for those of you that haven't heard much about Teach for America, it's basically a nonprofit, and their commitment is to close the educational gap in the United States. So their mantra is that students in high poverty, high risk communities have less access to a quality education versus students that are in very high affluent communities. And the reason they believe this happens is at a very young age in these low income communities, expectations are set a lot lower because of the circumstances that those children are in. So what Teach for America does is they say, hey, I think that really good teaching is just good, effective leadership, and we're going to take very strong leaders that are committed to this mission, place them in these high-risk schools for 2 years to raise the expectations, because those students absolutely have the same ability as everyone else, and close that achievement gap so that they can catch up and have the same opportunities. So probably like many of you, I didn't start out my career in HR. I started in teaching. That was my way. So I joined Teach for America right out of college, and I was placed in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I taught 8th grade science for 2 years. Didn't major in education. All I had was what like TFA was going to teach me of how I was going to do this well. And the model that they taught us was something called teaching as leadership. And there were kind of like 5 steps that they gave us. The first one was, in order to close this gap, number 1, you have to know the goal. What's the end goal of your classroom at the end of the year? What does success look like for your students? And what are the knowledge and skills and abilities that you're gonna have to teach them in order to get to this goal? The second thing is, once you define this, you have to relentlessly build strong relationships with your students so that they trust you and so that they're invested in you as their teacher, because if they trust you, they're gonna listen to you, and everything's gonna fall into place. The third thing was articulate the goal to them and invest them in what that goal is. Why is that goal important to their long-term career journey and journey in school? The fourth was backwards plan. So once you know the goal, create a backwards plan with the end in mind that's very strategic. And then lastly, it was measure. Using student data along the way, assess them often, and use that data to course correct and change where you're seeing that students aren't learning some of those skills. So sounds pretty easy, right? So I got to my school. I'm trying to think about how I'm going to build this plan. And when I got there, I learned that the 8th grade science test was tested in the state of North Carolina. So I had a very measurable goal that I needed to get my students to get to at the end of the year for them to be on the right trajectory to high school. What I learned was, before I got to the school, 27% of the 8th graders the year before passed that end of grade test. 27% of the 8th graders. So something was very wrong, and there was it was a very disruptive school environment that I found myself in. But I mean, all I had was this framework that TFA gave me. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna give it a shot. And I followed it to the best of my ability for the 2 years, really focusing on that last step, which was measuring and assessing my students often, and then using the data to get creative with where they weren't learning things. I learned that they couldn't read really well, so that gave me intel on how I could do really innovative activities to teach them. And by the end of the second year, we had moved from 27% of the 8th graders in the classroom passing the state test to almost 85% of them passing in 2 years. And it's funny, like, actually saying this out loud now, because 8 years later, that still sticks with me, that I was in this very disruptive, challenging environment, but this framework that Teach for America gave me, that these 5 steps really helped me narrow in on the gaps. What were the engagement gaps for my students? Number 2, it gave me a really strong leadership foundation to uncover this. And then third, it gave me an arsenal of teaching tools that I was able to break down really easily and help my students feel successful. And so I've kept that with me in my career. So flash forward. How the heck does this apply to the business world where you're trying to keep the right talent? Well, number 1, I'm sure you all feel this, that like the work environment is just hectic and crazy. It's stressful, kind of the way a school felt for me at times. And if you're in a human resources, people operations type role, it can be really easy to get caught up in like this day-to-day fire drill, business partners reaching out, help me, help with this situation, that survival mode I talked about in the beginning. And while there's always gonna be elements for us with that, because we're here to support the business, why I really deeply believe in the value of people operations and HR is, yes, we need to be there to support the business, but it's also our job to be courageous and hold up the mirror to leaders and the organization to say, this is the mission and this is the values I know you want to achieve. Here are some of the gaps where I'm seeing that we're missing, and bringing this focus and intentionality back. Because I'm going to overgeneralize this a little bit, but every company sets out with a strong mission and values. If companies held up that every day, every second of every day, strong talent would stay because they feel very deeply connected to those values happening. What ends up happening in very stressful situations is things fall to the wayside, things get stressful, and what the values are in a company or the intentions don't always hold up to be true due to stress, due to varying priorities, and that's when talent starts to leave because they get frustrated. And they're like, well, I thought this was the reason I was here, these were the values, this is the difference I'm seeing, I don't feel like I'm a priority, and that's where retention starts to be a challenge. So what I found to be helpful is this Teach for America framework I just talked about can actually translate to be able to find what those engagement gaps are, even in the state of disruption. So when you think about it, number 1, know the end goal. as in the classroom, that translates to the business of know the business. How does the company generate revenue? How is the company making money? How are the departments supposed to be working together to do this, or how are they not? The second step, rather than build relationships with students, it's build relationships with business partners. Build relationships at all levels of the organization, not just the senior VP in the department. Really get a pulse of all employees so that they trust you. Meet with them often and do what you say you're gonna do so that they believe that you're there to partner and you're gonna deliver. And then ongoing, it's step 3, is what I really think is the sweet spot for talent retention. That's where, rather than articulating the goal of the classroom back, you're articulating the gaps that you're finding in these conversations with your leaders to leaders, because they want to know what's going on with my teams. So the goal is ultimately you get a seat at the table in your organization where people are asking you, what are you hearing from the teams? What am I doing well? What am I not doing well? What can we change? And once you have that platform with the relationships you've built, step 4 is ultimately you're working with leaders on what your recommendations are, what the creative programs are, and then lastly, you're measuring and assessing engagement data, turnover data, exit interview data, all the ways to see if this is evolving. So when I got to Discovery Communications, I was the HR business partner for our ad sales team, and I spent a lot of time in steps 1 and 2. For about 3 to 4 months, I met with every leader, I job shadowed, I learned everything I could about the ad sales business. I asked leaders if I could meet with their teams to build their trust. I did focus groups with a lot of employees. I did a lot of exit interviews. I looked at their engagement survey data because they did an engagement survey the year before. And what I found was 3 things, 3 gaps that I kind of found. There were a lot of things, of course, Discovery was doing amazingly well, but 3 themes kind of surfaced for me with these engagement gaps. Number 1, the business was changing. They were moving from selling commercials on linear TV to selling ads on digital platforms, the digital transformation. And some departments were doing this really well and others were really struggling. So that was the first gap that I found. Second was there were some gaps in leaders being able to give feedback really well. And then third, there was this population of employees that had really high turnover. I was probably doing 3 to 5 exit interviews with them a month. And the themes I got from these entry-level employees was, my job's really monotonous. I don't understand how it connects to the big picture. I don't get feedback from my boss. Those were the things coming up over and over again. So I got to this point in step 3 where leaders were starting to ask me, what are you hearing from teams? I was starting to share this feedback. And then at the same time, harmoniously, the leader of the department came to our team and he said, I really want to invest in training. And he kind of didn't even know exactly what that meant, but he was like, I want this culture of training. I want a training program. Can you guys help? And so I saw this as an opportunity to take these engagement gaps that I found with understanding the big picture, transforming digital training, giving feedback regularly. And what I did was I worked really side by side with leaders. It took us about 7 months, and we created this program called Ad Sales Academy. And what we did was we defined what each role was in the department, and we defined the knowledge and skills of what it took to be successful in each of those roles. And then we made a calendar that included classes of every month of what we could do to help people learn those skills and abilities. It took a long time. We had to find internal experts that could teach some of these topics. We brought in an external digital training company that could train people on a lot of the digital skills. And then most importantly, we had to get a high amount of senior leadership attendance and buy-in. And then we got champions across the departments that were really strong to help go to these classes and help us design this program that really created this culture of learning. And what we found was this program started to close these gaps that we were finding, and I'll tell you how we knew. Turnover in the population that I told you of employees went down about 40% in a 9-month period because those entry-level employees were having an opportunity to go to classes, connect with people that they couldn't, and learned about the business big picture, and they felt more motivated. We had a large surge in digital learning through the digital platform that we brought in, and people were incorporating that into their roles. And then there was just a high amount of attendance and qualitative data. So people were talking about it all the time, reaching out about how they could be involved, and it ended up really being a culture shift for the organization. So quick fast forward. So what if you're like, okay, well, I don't really have time for 7 or 8 months to build this massive training program at my company. It looks different in any company that you're in, but the framework is the same. So I'm gonna give you a little preview of what we're doing at Kargo. Right now, Kargo is about 200 people, really small company, tech company, and I'm just finishing like phases 1 and 2 now. I've been there 4 months, so I've learned the business, I've met with business partners, traveled to all of the offices, and really gathered a lot of intel and worked closely with my own team on what's going well and then what are the engagement gaps. And what we found here is because we're tech and our business is pivoting really fast, our model's changing, there's this high sense of urgency where leaders are like, we need help now, like please give us something right now. So we don't have a luxury of waiting and building something for months. So we're rolling things out kind of agile style. But the three things that we're working against is business actually pivoting to more programmatic, and that's a different skill set and different talent. Number 2, the way that leaders at our company were getting feedback was not consistent. It wasn't fair. They were only going to certain populations of employees. And then the third was leaders are talking about high performance in different ways. They're not consistent with how they measure performance and values. So the things that we're trying to do at Kargo is, number 1, we're redoing our exit interview process. So we're taking exit interviews and we're making it a lot easier to collect actionable data. And then we're working to roll that up on a quarterly basis to help inform our leaders on the key themes for why people are leaving. So that's one thing that we're kind of cranking out as we go. The second thing that we're doing is we are replacing the temperature surveys that the company used to do, like these quarterly engagement surveys, with something called company council. And this is where an employee from each department is elected by their department, and they're serving as the feedback source from their teams, and they're regularly getting access to our executive team to present on what they're finding, and exec is using them to bounce ideas off of them. And the last thing that we're bringing is talent planning for the first time. So we're going to bring a framework and a set of leadership training so that leaders are a little more consistent with how they define high performance and how they assess our company values really consistently. So stay tuned, more to come, but those are some of the things that we're working on at Kargo to retain some of our talent that's going to help us pivot forward. So to just kind of sum everything up, I hope that this has been helpful in just wrapping up that work has become non-traditional, and so companies need to be really non-traditional and intentional in the ways that they keep talent, because your talent is going to be everything to help you move to the next level. To be able to do this is about 3 things. First is finding those engagement gaps and finding where the gaps are in culture. Second is really developing yourself as a leader to be able to uncover what those are. And then the third is using what you find with those gaps to bring in ideas about programs, change management, little tools so that leaders can very, very effectively and simply execute on them to close the gaps. And I do think there is a nice little hybrid of teaching skills that fall along with this. And I would say just in closing, if this is work that really excites you, and this is something that really motivates you to do at a company, so much of this is just about relationship management, how you build relationships with every level of the organization and how you build their trust. And then for you as an HR professional, it's about how are you building your own arsenal or your own toolkit of learning and development and organizational development tools that you can very quickly customize and roll out to leaders hand in hand with them so that they're able to execute on it really easily. So I hope that this has been helpful, and if there's any time, I would be happy to open it up for questions now, or I'll be around for the entire day and happy to share more. Thank you.